Vignette 3. Vision in the Barkot Valley by Dr. Mohammed Sadiq. It was December 1983. I left my village of Sotan in Dara-e-Nur Valley for the nearby valley of Barkot. I had 5 of my mujahideen with me. In Barkot Valley, we stopped at the village of Dudreg, where we spent the night in a mujahideen guest house, map 8-3 Vision. Dudreg is the last village in the valley before the forest begins. In this area, the mountains are all heavily wooded with pine, juniper, and sycamore. It was foggy, rainy, and very cold. There were other mujahideen from IRMA staying in the house next door to ours. After supper, everyone but my sentry went to bed. I was asleep and dreaming. In my dream, I saw a man in a white robe who laid his hand on my shoulder and said, "You will prevail." Then the man dropped ammunition in my lap and gave me an Enfield rifle. "This is the time to go forward," the man said. I woke up and looked around. I could not find any ammunition or Enfield rifle, but I checked to make sure that my Kalashnikov and pistol were still under my pillow as I was thinking about the dream. At 0030 hours, I again awoke as I heard a shot fired. I scrambled to my feet and asked the sentry what was going on. "Nothing, everything is all right," Agagul replied. I lay back down. Shortly afterward, I heard another shot. I jumped up, pulled on my shoes, and grabbed my weapons. The other mujahideen were also up. I looked outside. The sentry said, "The Soviets are here. We are surrounded. I see their signal rockets all around us." The other group of IRMA mujahideen rushed out into the night and up into the mountains. My 5 mujahideen asked me, "What should we do?" I replied, "Well, they've come for us, so let's give them a fight." The enemy had us surrounded and had blocked all the exits by this time. The house that we were in had a large, enclosed courtyard, 60 meters by 60 meters. The enemy were firing at us, and they knew exactly where we were. I went to the back of the enclosure and crawled over the wall into a narrow, meter-wide alley. I asked my mujahideen to follow me. We moved down the alley and into the open fields. I could see Soviets in the open field. I told my mujahideen that I would lay down a base of fire so that they could cross the field. Once they crossed the field, they were to go to the flank of the field and hold it. Just behind us was the house where the IRMA mujahideen had stayed. I did not know that they had gone and were worried that they would unintentionally fire into our backs. I fired as my mujahideen crossed the field, but they came under fire. We all fired back and retreated into the mountains. As we started up at the mountains, we bumped into still more Soviets who were positioned in the mountains. As we were taking shelter behind a wall, one of my mujahideen was hit and killed. We did not know this area very well, so we did not know how to get out. It took us about 3 hours to find our way safely up into the mountain. As we reached the mountain, we met the IRMA mujahideen who had escaped earlier. They asked us to use tracer rounds to mark targets for their mortars. I fired at the enclosure that we had started out from with tracer bullets. The IRMA mujahideen then fired their mortar at the enclosure. As daylight broke, the IRMA mujahideen mortar fire became more effective. In all, they fired 42 mortar rounds. The Soviets did not want to stay around and get mortared, so they withdrew. As I watched the Soviets pull back, I realized that we had prevailed and that my dream had come true. It was now time to go forward. After the battle, I learned that the IRMA mujahideen also had one of their group killed by the Soviets. 2 Afghan women were also killed near the enclosure. The Soviet force had come from Jalalabad, about 20 kilometers away. They had come at night on their APCs. They were guided by an Afghan named Nader. He was from Shewa. Since the DRA was established in this area, the people were divided in their loyalties, and people like Nader worked against us. Commentary. The mujahideen were lax about security in this area, despite the known divided loyalties within the populace. The guest house that the mujahideen were staying in was not a private home, but a mujahideen guest house regularly used by mujahideen passing through the area. All the local villagers knew about its presence and function. The Soviets' guide came from Shewa, which is 15 kilometers away, and yet he had no trouble pinpointing its location at night. The Soviets drove through a well-populated area on APCs to conduct their raid, yet the Mujahideen got no advance warning, and their sentry was surprised. The Mujahideen were complacent about security and set patterns that the Soviets reacted to. Only the presence of the Mujahideen mortar and a large stock of mortar ammunition saved them. Vignette 4. Surprised by the Soviets in the Dara-e-Nur by Dr. Mohammad Sadiq. In March 1984, the DRA and Soviet forces again tried to destroy the Mujahideen forces in the Dara-e-Nur Valley. A total of 120 Mujahideen armed with 7 RPGs, 1 82mm mortar, 1 Dishka, and mini Kalashnikovs blocked their advance at Shokyali village, which is located at the junction of Dara-e-Nur and Barkot valleys. Map 8-4 Barkot. We positioned our forces to block both valleys and the high ground between them. The enemy came and tried to overcome our defenses but failed. Then the government sent a group of the area's elders to talk to us. The elders tried to persuade us not to fight in the area and to leave, but we refused. We held the area for another year before the enemy brought another column against us. Nader, the DRA police chief for the area, sent us a message also trying to persuade us not to continue to fight in this area. He warned us that, if we did not leave, the Soviets would destroy all the villages in the area. It was now April 1985. At 20:30 hours one evening, my group left the village of Sotan. We were armed with an RPG-7 and Kalashnikovs. We were moving to the junction of the 2 valleys along the foot of the mountains. One of my men stated, "I will fire a shot to show our presence and let the people know that we were not cowards. It will show that we are not intimidated and that we are still here." I tried to talk him out of it, but he finally fired the shot. As soon as he fired, the night lit up with return fire from all the Soviets who were discovered in the area in force. The Soviets had arrived the previous night and had waited all day for us. We had not reached the junction yet, but were at a place called Kar. The Soviets were firing at us from positions on the mountain. To the west and to the east is a steep canyon with a sheer 150-meter wall. We were trapped and surrounded. So we went to ground and fought back through the night and next day. With the day, helicopters came and fired at us. We grimly held our position and waited for the next night when we could try a breakout. But the Soviets had also had enough fighting and they pulled out at the end of the day. I lost 1 KIA and 1 WIA. I do not know if there were any Soviet casualties. Commentary. The Mujahideen believed in the invulnerability of their defenses and let the routines of positional defense dull their alertness. The Soviets again were able to infiltrate a force deep into Mujahideen territory and take them by surprise. The lack of Mujahideen discipline triggered the ambush, but apparently triggered the ambush prematurely before the entire force was in the kill zone. Mujahideen leaders, led by consensus, force of personality, and moral persuasion. The Mujahideen failed to man their defenses around the clock, and the Soviets were able to move through their unmanned positions and surprise the Mujahideen. It is unclear whether the Soviets were in a deliberate ambush or were waiting for nightfall to move on Sotan to attack the Mujahideen. One of the problems that a guerrilla movement has is that the people who suffer the retaliations for guerrilla actions are usually the civilian populace. What starts as a popular cause, supported enthusiastically by the populace, can sour when the local populace has to bear the reprisals with no apparent end in sight. The local populace that remains often just wants to be left alone by all sides. The Mujahideen in this area lost a great deal of local support and, consequently, intelligence information and early warning. Chapter Commentary. Mujahideen local security was often lax in those areas which they controlled or which Soviet DRA forces had not visited in a while. Often, Mujahideen local security was even lax in areas adjacent to major Soviet and DRA garrisons. KHAD infiltrators and informers often managed to provide timely information that resulted in successful raids. The Mujahideen often failed to post security at a sufficient distance from their force to provide adequate warning. Instead, they relied on local inhabitants to provide that warning. In areas where the local populace had fled or were tired of the war, the Mujahideen were blind. The factional nature of the Mujahideen also discouraged the distribution of timely intelligence to all Mujahideen forces in an area. The Mujahideen often failed to plan against raids, constitute a ready reaction force, designate escape routes, and assembly areas and rehearse their defense. Aggressive Soviet or DRA raids had a good chance of success against unprepared Mujahideen. The trick was to withdraw before the Mujahideen had a chance to recover and pursue.